I personally reject the idea that the United States should be seeking to be the leader of the world. I think this has been a mistake the United States has pursued after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What's happening is the United States is essentially still trying to pursue this policy of global liberal hegemony without resources to actually back it up. Now, the question is, how best do you avoid getting into a Middle East war? I think you cannot just project weakness. So I think we should be putting significantly more economic pressure on the Iranians and other ways while supporting our local allies, but being very clear to them that we are not going to get into another significant Middle East conflict. If the Chinese dominate Asia, that's going to have far, far greater consequences for Americans than if the Russians dominate Europe or if the Iranians dominate the Middle East. There are bad things that happen in the world, but we understand that we have limited resources, political will, etc. And so I think that's the way to look at it. I do support the Ukrainians. I also have a plausible alternative, which is the Europeans should step up. If there's a war and we lose, that's very bad, because the thing that China can actually use to coerce countries is direct military force. I mean, I think one of the clear lessons of the Ukraine conflict, and it was evident before, but it's become even more evident, is that economic sanctions do not really work. To get back to that point, what we want is more countries like India that have a very strong military, that have clear interests that they're unafraid to define, and will take the initiative to address them without holding Uncle Sam's hand. Like, we don't want more dependencies.
On Hindustan Times podcast today, we are joined by Elbridge Colby, former Department of Defense official and founder of the Marathon Initiative, a U.S. think tank focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. I'm going to talk to you, sir, about the great power competition, Elbridge. We are in an era of conflict, and the big daddy, United States, is involved in all of these conflicts. There are two active conflicts in the form of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war, and at least one looming conflict in the form of China-Taiwan. Now, each of these conflicts today pose a direct challenge to the United States playing the role of leader of the world, be it China, be it Russia, or Iran in the case of the Israel-Hamas war. They're all challenging the U.S. supremacy. Why do you think things have come to such an impasse?
Well, great to be with you, and great to be on your show again, and always a pleasure to talk to Hindustan Times and friends in India in particular, and hopefully beyond. Well, first of all, I would just say that I personally reject the idea that the United States should be seeking to be the leader of the world. I think this has been a mistake the United States has pursued after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think it's a very important point, because often you'll see, and certainly in the American discussion, but also in the European discussion elsewhere, that there are doubts about the U.S. post-war, i.e. this post-Second World War role. I don't think that's true. I think the problem is actually more the post-Cold War world, and in a sense, the hubris the United States embarked upon pursuing what the neoconservative theorist Robert Kagan calls global liberal hegemony. During the Cold War, the United States was leader of a bloc, so-called free world bloc. Obviously, India's place in that was somewhat more nuanced, being the world's largest democracy. But from our perspective, it was the kind of quote unquote free world bloc, and the Soviet Union was the head of the other bloc. And of course, they were going on with the non-aligned movement. But the United States pursued a strategy of containment. At the time, people didn't think the United States was pursuing global liberal hegemony. People thought the United States was pursuing containment. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States did pursue global liberal hegemony and a kind of construction of an order, quote unquote, to back that up. I think this was a grave mistake, and we're now dealing with the consequences because we overstretched ourselves, and it was not necessary for our interest. And so people are kind of caught up on the idea of our post, sort of think 1999 intervening in Kosovo or Iraq, or, and it was on both sides. I mean, Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, said, we see farther, we're the indispensable nation. But George W. Bush, the Republican president at the beginning of the century, said, we are going to end tyranny in the world. And theorists behind him, like Bill Kristol and David Frum, said, we are going to end evil in the world. So I think this was a mistake. Now, get to your specific question of, what's happening in the world. Well, I think there is a as was predicted by many people who were critical of this approach, there has emerged a balancing coalition. The United States did pursue a policy that was beyond its means and not necessary. I mean, we spent 20 years in the Middle East with very little to show for it. I mean, you see the Houthis and others, and the Iranian nuclear program are still going on, and weakened ourselves. And of course, you also had the global financial crisis and other things, ill-advised, macroeconomic policy. The building up of China through the kind of Chimerica approach over, especially once China entered the WTO. And so the United States, what's happened is that, as Xi Jinping likes to quote Napoleon, nobody really knows if Napoleon actually said it, but when China rises, the world will quake, and India is kind of following behind in power terms. China's a lot richer and stronger at this point, but we'll see in the future. But I think that what's happening is the United States is essentially still trying to pursue this policy of global liberal hegemony without resources to actually back it up. And what you are seeing is a range of actors that have reason to push for, this U.S.-led kind of post-Cold War system are increasingly working together and seeking to exploit opportunities to, pursue their own interests in aligned ways. So, I mean, I think this term is very unhelpful, but you have people talking about axis of evil. I think that's a almost childish way of putting it. But, you have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, I mean, even Venezuela, other countries. I assume Pakistan is looking for opportunities. Countries that are aggrieved, that have revision. You've seen Azerbaijan. They would not have probably tried this 25 years ago because the United States was so powerful. And also the United States established allies, especially in NATO, Japan, constituted the bulk of the rest of global power. I mean, I think the G7 in the 1990s was something on the order of like 75% of global GDP. I might have a little bit off. Now it's well below 50%. So things have changed. And so that's what's fundamentally going on. And the critical thing for the United States is to adapt its policy to be a more realistic one, which I think aligns us very closely with India because we share interests. But unfortunately, that process is going much more slowly in the United States than it should be.
Very, very interesting. There are a lot of sub questions that I have from various points that you've put across right now. But let me just go with the three actors that you named. You talked about China, you talked about Russia, you talked about Iran, you also talked about North Korea. Which of these global actors do you see as the most challenging or the most dangerous for the United States?
Oh, by far and away, it's China. I mean, look, I'm a realist, which I think, at the end of the day is the best way of looking at the world from an international relations point of view, at least. And China is by far the most powerful actor. I mean, it's 10 times the GDP of Russia. Russia is incredibly dependent on China now. Iran is a fraction of the size of China. I don't know, it's probably 1/30th or something. And North Korea is probably even smaller than that. So China is by far, as Xi Jinping said, and quoting Napoleon, the world is shaking. I mean, for the first time in 150 years, the United States is not clearly the world's largest economy. I mean, there are arguments about whether China will ever actually surpass the United States in market exchange rate terms. But, for a variety of reasons, purchasing power parity, especially in the geopolitical or military context, is more revealing. And China is actually a larger economy than the United States by that standard. And it also clearly, without dispute, has by far the world's largest industrial base. It's been pointed out by our Office of Naval Intelligence that China has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. So, Russia, in my view, is a threat to European NATO in particular, and of course to Ukraine. But it pales in comparison to China. And of course, Iran even pales even more than that.
So I'm going to talk about China, and I'm even going to talk about Russia, but I want to start with Iran, who you say is the least of the threats so far, as you perceive it. But this particular country, it's got its militaries. I won't even call it militaries. It's militia spread all across the Middle East, and they are targeting the United States. They are targeting U.S. soldiers. They are targeting U.S. Establishments in the region. And for some reason, America is still not openly naming Iran, not openly sort of calling out Iran's role in the Israel-Hamas war. Do you think that's That's a strategy, part of the strategy of denial that you've written in your book.
Well, I certainly wouldn't put this administration as a most effective implementer of the strategy of denial. They have actually pursued elements of it rhetorically, particularly in the Department of Defense, but I would not subscribe to their approach. I mean, I think we need to step back before we look at this, because it's really important to view this in context. I mean, as I was referring to before, in the 1990s, the United States could wage multiple simultaneous conflicts with adversaries like North Korea or Iraq or Iran, and do so effectively and in a way that was relatively tolerable for the American people. That is not the case anymore, partially because, most significantly, because of the rise of China and its growing military capability and ambitions, which, a realist is not surprised to see that as China rises in power, its ambitions expand, its military expands, et cetera, et cetera. Also because we squandered a lot of our military power and our people's resolve in fruitless wars in the Middle East, above all the war in Iraq, but also the nation-building campaign in Afghanistan, intervention in Syria and Libya and so forth. And that's left us in a pretty parlous position where we are not able to confront multiple. Contrary to a lot of the rhetoric over the situation in Ukraine, we're not able to walk and chew gum at the same time. In fact, it's an absurd, I would say it's an insult to the intelligence of the American people that phrase is used, because if you look at fine print at all, in fact, you don't even have to look at the fine print, you just read the newspaper. For instance, there was an article by Greg Ip in the Wall Street Journal, he's the leading economics commentator, just how bad our industrial base for the military is in. So if you look at that, we're on track potentially to lose a war with the Chinese in the decisive theater. So China is by far the most significant rival, 10 times the size of Russia, and Asia is the world's most important market area. I mean, for hundreds of years, Europe was the center of the world because that's where economic productivity was concentrated, and tragically, in the case of India, it was where the imperial centers were located. So if you won in Europe, then you won everywhere. You didn't need to win in Southwest Africa or whatever. If you won in Europe, you could fix everything afterwards. And that is essentially now Asia. Obviously, it's very difficult for the Europeans to wrap their heads around that, and frankly, many in the United States, especially on the East Coast. But that's just the fact of the matter. Okay, so if that's the situation, then you look at the rest of the world. It's all relative. It's about priority. You got to get things right in Asia, which is not what we're doing. Secondarily, you would say, Europe is still, even though declining significantly, is still a major market area, and the Russians are, one of the major powers of the world. Okay, so that's kind of your second place. And then you'd get to the Middle East, which is, a very small fraction of global GDP. I think it's below 5%. And if you take out the oil areas, in the Arabian Peninsula, it's far smaller than that. So the Middle East is not very important. Especially outside of the Gulf, and even with the Gulf, it's a tertiary theater. And Iran is a much smaller threat. You mentioned the militias. Yeah, they're militias. They're not the PLA. They're not the Red Army. They're not the Nazis or something like that. It's a much smaller threat. I mean, they're nasty. They're bad. I mean, in some sense. But this is not a morality play. This is about serving the interests, in my case, enlightened self-interest of the American people. And I would expect other countries to do the same. And that's, I think, the approach that India is commendably pursuing for itself. And you mentioned the attacks on troops, and a lot of that is because we've left these, sort of lily pads or these sort of small dollops of American soldiers essentially exposed throughout the Middle East. So it leaves this easy. I'm honestly unclear why we have forces distributed in these small bases throughout. For instance, I don't really understand what U.S. forces are doing in Syria. We won the Cold War while the Syrians were on the Soviet side, so it can't be that important for us. I mean, I certainly express or feel, sympathy for the suffering of the people in Syria, although I'm not sure that the civil war helped it along, frankly, especially given that the result has been, essentially a restoration of the status quo ante. So, I mean, my view is, look, the case of Iran is a difficult one, and I'm not in favor of just ignoring the Middle East. My basic view, and this is very relevant for India, it's the same logic essentially that I apply between India and Israel, which is we don't want any more dependencies. We have plenty of allies who essentially free ride on us. I mean, I think this is a technical term. Countries like, Japan is moving in the right direction, but spends well below 2% of GDP on defense, and has not been in a conflict since the Second World War, partially because of our own policy, but partially their own as well. You look at countries like Germany or Canada, they're not pulling their weight, or New Zealand. No, we need countries that pull their own weight and that are willing to go and address security problems that we cannot afford to be intervening all over the world, but they address their security problems on their own. And countries like India and Israel are countries that spend a lot on defense, have very capable militaries, and basically are saying, look, leave us, give us support and get out of the way. And that's my view. So that I think in the case of the Middle East, what we want to do is build on the Abraham Accords framework, which was obviously going on before Hamas attacks, with the Israelis, with the Saudis, with the Emirates. It's going to be complicated because the Iranians are playing both sides. The Chinese are more active. But I think that's the way. And the thing that we need like a hole in the head is to get into another Middle East war. Now, the question is, how best do you avoid getting into a Middle East war? I think you cannot just project weakness. So I think we should be putting significantly more economic pressure on the Iranians in other ways while supporting our local allies, but being very clear to them that we are not going to get into another significant Middle East conflict.
So you're saying the $6 billion freezing of funds of the Iranians by the Biden administration is really not the right way to go about it, because that is a dent in the sea that is the Iranian defense and these militias that they are sort of commandeering.
Well, look, I think the proof is in the pudding, and I'm not the world's expert on how to deal with Iran or the Middle East. I mean, there's others who I would kind of look to on this issue. But I think the policy of opening up the Iranian bank accounts, sanctions relief, has obviously failed. I mean, like QED, right? So it seems to me, I think there are downsides to the policy of maximum pressure. But I think at this point, it seems to make the most sense to combine firm, aggressive economic measures on the Iranians, which is relatively something that we can afford, and then active support to other countries in the region that are willing to take the lead, kind of on security, including Israel.
You also say that, and I've been through your recent Twitter timeline. X timeline now after Elon Musk's, renaming saga. So you're very clear on one thing that, and as you've just pointed out, that Iran is not the big threat for the U.S. For the world per se.
Certainly not for the U.S. It is for others like Israel, I bet, and I can get into that.
But for Israel, yes, but not for the world at large and for the U.S.
Right.
And similarly for Russia, because you very categorically said that you morally support the Ukrainian defense, and the invasion of Ukraine was an evil act by Russians. But the United States needs to face the fact that we can't do everything in the world. Some would say you're advocating that America abandon Ukraine now that you have bigger fish to fry.
Well, I am in the biggest fish to fry camp, because that is by far the most significant and consequential challenge to American interests. So let there be no ambiguity about that. If we had unlimited resources, support more robust funding of the Ukrainians, and for that matter, in the Middle East as well. But we don't. So, I mean, to me, we're all adults, right? I mean, there are bad things that happen in the world, but we all recognize that we're not omnipotent, that we can't solve all the problems in the world. And there's sort of this moralistic argument that because something bad happens in Europe, that we are obligated to act in a self-defeating way to try to rectify it. And I just don't, I think stepping back for a second, so I've made the strategic argument. Look, if the Chinese dominate Asia, and obviously India is well aware of this, but if the Chinese dominate Asia, that's going to have far, far greater consequences for Americans than if the Russians dominate Europe or if the Iranians dominate the Middle East. Neither of which is going to happen, right? So, let's get to that. The Russian economy is smaller than the German economy alone, let alone the Europeans in general, who are not spending anywhere near what they could on defense. Likewise, Iran is not even the largest economy in the Middle East, whereas China is 50% of the GDP of Asia. And Indians, I think, are very realistic about how powerful China is. So when we think about this kind of from I actually reject firmly and vehemently the notion that the policy of global liberal hegemony is more moral than the policy I'm at. I actually think it's immoral, because if you look at it from the policy, from a morality more of stewardship, I mean, you can find it in the gospel, the Christian gospel. I'm sure you can find it in other faith traditions, which is essentially like the policy a parent takes, right? You know, you're not, it doesn't matter what you intend. If you had the best wishes, but your child starves, you're not acting in a moral way. If a parent gives all his money to charity and his child starves, that's not acting morally, because your primary responsibility is to make sure your child is okay. That's your responsibility. And it's more the morality of stewardship. By the logic of the morality of stewardship, the United States is actually, I believe, is actually acting in a somewhat immoral way, because the consequences that we're now facing are anticipatable. We know we don't have the ability to do all these things, to walk and chew gum at the same time. So pretending that we are is moralism, not morality. So that's the look at it. Okay, if you look at it from that perspective, Asia is the priority, and it's not only politically prudent, geopolitically prudent, but also actually morally obligatory to take care of the most significant challenges in a rational and empirically grounded way, then blowing well over $100 billion that we could have used to strengthen our position in Asia, and sending weapons that cannot be replaced for years and years, and investing political resolve that is scarce. That's not responsible. And that doesn't obligate me to think like, I don't care about the Ukrainians. I mean, in 1975, let's take the 1976. Look, I mean, I think the extent of the American war in Indochina was ill-advised. I think we had a reasonable interest to some degree, but we overinvested. Once we lost that war, once the North Vietnamese had taken over the South, I mean, and the Khmer Rouge had taken over in Cambodia. I mean, it was a human tragedy way beyond what's happening in Russia. But I don't think anybody was calling for us to intervene in Cambodia. I mean, just to take an example, right? I mean, that's the sort of, there are bad things that happen in the world, but we understand that we have limited resources, political will, etc. And so I think that's the way to look at it. I do support the Ukrainians. I also have a plausible alternative, which is the Europeans should step up. And this gets to a kind of a central point that really is one of the reasons that I think that the United States is so aligned with India, and also my own personal view is very much aligned with the Indian foreign policy of recent years, which is work with countries based on their interests, and where their interests are most touched. The current administration and a lot of the traditional kind of neoconservative Republicans, older Republicans were more along the line of what I'm talking about, but the last generation, they kind of want to, foreign policy becomes more of like a morality play. Countries have shared values, and that's ostensibly why they'll cooperate on everything around the globe. In practice, the Europeans talk like that, but actually it's to their benefit because it's led the Americans to focus on Europe. So they talk that talk because it benefits them. My view is that countries, Germany is not going to bail us out in a conflict over Taiwan. I can assure you, it doesn't even make sense for them. My view is, look, work with countries. You're never going to get the Germans to, deploy divisions to the island of Taiwan or Luzon or something. And it doesn't even make sense. Get the Europeans to work on the things that they care about. The Poles are very worried about the Russians. The Romanians are worried. The Balts. And I think the Germans could be if they push forward a little bit. Similarly, work with India, where its interests are most engaged. Obviously China, but South Asia in general. And in exchange, take a more, a less imperious role than Washington has taken over the last generation, where, to quote that Madeleine Albright line, we see farther. There's a hubris and an arrogance to that. And I love America. I think we're great. I'm not lashing ourselves as a country. Everybody has committed sins, etc. But it's more about, look, if we're gonna do less, we should work with countries, empower them, get behind their policy preferences, instead of insisting on everything that we should do. They should do whatever we say. So in my view, and I've written this in the Hindustan Times, we should say, look, in South Asia, we're not going to go along with anything that New Delhi says, but generally speaking, we want India to be a strong bulwark against China. We don't want it to be distracted. Let's basically take India's side, as I wrote 4 or 5 years ago in the Wall Street Journal. Because of the Americans were going back to the usual thing. Oh, let's mediate between India and Pakistan. No. We need to have key allies.
That's the Kissinger era, right?
Yeah, but exactly, it's gotten better. But it's like, look, we need a strong India to stand up to China. India needs us. Let's not complicate this issue over essentially secondary or tertiary, or I don't even know what comes after tertiary, which is what Pakistan is from our point of view at this point.
Okay, so you say that the resources need to be focused in China and on developing our the partnership with India, and get India to become a credible alternative to China. Um, where do you think? Because right now that's not happening, and you mentioned it, that not happening the way it should be happening, from the point of the from where the United States is standing. What do you think is coming in the way?
I think it's hubris and an underestimation of China. Honestly, I think a lot of the political leadership in the United States is very old, and the way I put it is that they, frankly, they still think the Chinese are riding around on bicycles and mass suits, and that just ain't so. I mean, and it's an extra. I mean, China has grown faster and at a scale that I think is never. I think it's accurate to say has never been seen in human history. So it's extraordinarily rapid, and so even over the last 20 years, it's been mind-boggling. And it's just very difficult for people to process, particularly older people. And on both sides of the aisle, there are older people in positions of control. So I think if people appreciated just how strong it is and will be, despite the economic headwinds, et cetera, of course, they're going to have trouble. They're not 10 feet tall, but they're like maybe 7 feet tall. I guess I don't know if you probably use meters in India now, but they're pretty. They're very, very tall. Like they're not 4 feet tall, 5 feet tall. They're not a whatever. I think that is the biggest. And I think there are a lot of Americans, particularly in the policymaking elite class, who are very personally wedded to the kind of, and I mean, this is going to make me sound a little bit like, I mean, I think some of the new left critiques have merit. I mean, I think there is an establishment or a blob in the United States whose interests are detached in the material part from the interests of normal Americans. I think if regular Americans were voting, the policies would actually be considerably different. But foreign policy is highly concentrated in our executive branch, in the presidency, and in senior members of Congress who have grown up in a different era and become very acculturated. I mean, a somewhat, maybe small, but I think telling example is the function, for instance, of the Munich Security Conference. Why do people care so much about Europe? Why have they? Because there's a strong socialization policy, and people go to Munich Security Conference. It's considered a very fashionable and highbrow thing to do. And that, I think, has kind of warped to some extent the American people's or their leaders' view of the world situation, because from a human point of view, these people are told, you see farther, you're so important in America, you're so wise. That's not what Indian friends always tell us, to your credit. I prefer honesty. But that's a lot of what's going on. So there's this hubris, and then there's this kind of sunk cost of, people who've spent years and years, expanding Western institutions into farther and farther into Eastern Europe, trying to liberalize and stabilize the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. It's very difficult. And I get a lot of personal hostility to people when I'm saying, look, like, I don't think those were necessary. In many cases, I think those were a mistake on their own terms, not on everything. But it doesn't matter, because like now we have a much, much bigger fish to fry, as you put it. And that just people find it very difficult, and they lash out, actually, which suggests to me that there's a deep personal investment. But I mean, to me, to get back to like what's a moral foreign policy? Well, our foreign policy should be serving the interests, the long-term and enlightened interests of the American people. Isn't that what a republic is for? This is not a dynastic arrangement where we're serving like the interests of the Bourbon monarchy or something. We should be actually, and I mean, the thing that's bizarre in the American context, or I get from the Europeans, is it's not a rational counter argument. A lot of times it's a much more aggressive, which suggests to me they kind of know in the back of their head that they don't have the right counter argument. But it's unfortunately, I think things are moving in the right direction as the generations change. The problem is the China challenge, et cetera, is like now. So we don't have time.
What about this recent controversy regarding this assassination plot of a Sikh, terrorist? I would call him, because he's a designated terrorist according to India, on U.S. soil. I mean, is that part of this entire? I mean, is that going to be a blip on the relations?
Well, I mean, look, I don't know all the facts. I will say, definitely, I'm very much against anybody trying to conduct assassinations on U.S. territory. And if that was the case, then I think that was condemnable by the Indian government. I don't know if that was the case. I don't know enough of the
No,
facts.
right
But in the
now
same,
it's all up in the
in this, right, in this, so I let me be clear that I don't impute a responsibility on the part of India. I don't have the basis to say that. But in the same way that India does not want us to be conducting, extra legal activities on Indian soil. So I think, look, I mean, the main point I would say is that our interests are profound and deep, or excuse me, the alignment of our interests is profound and deep. And both of us should be taking real measures to try to avoid disrupting that, because, in a sense, that's sort of inevitable. That alignment is inevitable because we share interests. But of course, countries, if they get in fights and disputes, they can inhibit that ability to cooperate. So, that's what I would say about that.
How do you see this going forward? If it were an ideal situation, how would you see India partnering with the United States to counter China?
Well, as I've written in your pages, I think it's a division of labor model, which I think this should be, I would think, music to India's ears. And I'm not just saying that because I'm not trying to impress you. It's just the logic of my position, which is, look, the United States really needs to focus its effort on the decisive theater, which is the first island chain, because a lot of the wealth of Asia is concentrated along the maritime periphery of East Asia, right? And our allies, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, not so much the Philippines, but the potential for ASEAN in the future, Australia, et cetera. And so if the Chinese dominate the first island chain nations, we fall back to the second island chain at best. Then we're dealing with the Marianas and the Marshall Islands, the Solomons. That's not a sustainable position. Those are very, very poor, small states. So we really need to hold the line at the first island chain. It's not clear that we will be able to hold Taiwan. I hope we can. I think we should do everything we possibly can to do so within reason, but we're cutting it really close. So in that context, we don't need to get distracted in Europe or the Middle East or Latin America or anything. Obviously, we have other more direct interests, particularly in Central America. But in the same way, South Asia. I mean, look, because my basic view is that actually a balance of power will emerge naturally in a war, because we've already seen that, and you see that, of course, in India and many other places in Asia. There's already dramatic pushback and balancing behavior against China as ambitions have become more expansive and it's become more aggressive, right? So in a sense, if there's no war, we don't really have a problem, in my view, because countries will de-risk. There will be a diversification of supply chains to countries like India and in ASEAN, et cetera, et cetera. If there's a war and we win, that would be tragic, but we would be okay. If there's a war and we lose, that's very bad, because the thing that China can actually use to coerce countries is direct military force. I mean, I think one of the clear lessons of the Ukraine conflict, and it was evident before, but it's become even more evident, is that economic sanctions do not really work in general, but certainly not against a major power. I mean, they're actually like laughably bad. I mean, if it were not so tragic, they are risibly ineffective. I mean, Russia's selling above the price, partially because they're selling to India. But I mean, what do we expect? To get back to my point about rational self-interest, you have the Europeans lecturing you, but you have 1.4 billion people that you've got to provide energy for. I mean, what are we thinking? You have other problems. And of course, India, as I think Foreign Minister Jaishankar rightly points out, there's a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, where were we in the Pakistan wars, et cetera, and the Europeans? So that's just a reality. So if economic sanctions aren't going to work, they also don't work for China. Their economic sanctions have backfired in places like India, even Taiwan. So if there's a military option, then they can, in a sense, to use a shorthand, obviously it's simplistic, but a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. I think that is their goal, actually, especially as economic sanctions turn up from the United States and other countries. China has more and more interest for a secure geoeconomic sphere that we don't want. And of course, India doesn't want, because it would be a critical constituent part. The thing, if we look at it then from this military point of view, India is a very strong bulwark. Obviously, the Himalayas are a very difficult barrier. So the Chinese military route into South Asia is very, it's very tough. China's best strategy is clearly to project power through the first island chain, through Southeast Asia into the Pacific, and that's what they're doing. So if we can hold them there, I think all of us would be in better shape. And India is strong enough to hold its own in South Asia. So the issue then is to make sure India is strong and capable enough, and that we support India in the ways necessary to uphold that.
You say militarily, it makes sense because economic sanctions are not going to cut it as far as reigning in China is concerned. But America has fallen way behind China when it comes to, let's take one statistic, let's say, of shipbuilding. The US Navy has some 200 odd something ships, and China, I think by 2025 plans to have about 400 plus ships. Now, I'm talking naval might, as it now seems that China is becoming the world leader in an industry which is critical to maritime security, and that feeds into what you're saying about the Pacific. So if unchecked, this is going to lead to perhaps an invasion of Taiwan in the near future, a domination of the South China Sea in the midterm future, and the long-term future, who knows, a challenge to US and its allies worldwide, including India.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the plan. So China's, I mean, my view, and I think if you've looked at my Twitter feed, I am not anti-Chinese or anything like that. To the contrary, the part of the reason that I'm so worried about China is because I have so much respect for what they've done. I'm not a fan of the Chinese Communist Party, to say the least. I think communism is horrible, evil, but it's not our job to right every wrong in the world, as we were, or our duty, talking about earlier. But China is enormously powerful and growing. It does face economic challenges. I think the basic dynamic that's happening right now is that, and the reason that I stress that is because I think China's incentives to project power more and to consider resort to military force are not purely like Xi Jinping's personal sort of feelings or a function of overly heated Chinese nationalism. Rather, they are also grounded in a rational assessment. So if you look, I think, at the most compelling scholarship on why great power wars happen and great power rivalries, it's often because there's a clash between what, again, you could think of as the geoeconomic spheres. Again, the stakes here are about economic productivity and money. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew, I think, memorably said to Deng Xiaoping, look, this is not the 12th century, the Mongols taking over to expand territory. What you want is intensive development, economic productivity at scale. That's what leads to strength. And strength is a better position. I mean, this is an obvious thing in places like India, where you were under exploitative foreign rule for 200 years, right? Or China itself, which was not formally colonized under imperial control, but effectively was, and for quite a long time. That you need to be strong, and if you're strong, the dollar, the rupee, or the yuan follows the flag at some level, and you will be able to make sure that you can reorient. I mean, why did the British Empire arise, right? The British Empire was a secure geoeconomic sphere. Export products to, import on a favorable basis, et cetera. I mean, there's obviously things have changed, but especially when you consider that Xi Jinping, again, not irrationally, thinks that we are trying to contain and suppress China's further economic growth, it has very strong incentives to say, look, I want to create a very large, secure area for my markets, trade, and then I'll have the best universities, I'll have the best companies. My sanctions will, instead of the Americans having to get everybody in line over Iran sanctions, China will be able to tell everybody what to do on sanctions. So that's a rational goal. Now, as I said before, I don't think there's any chance that they're going to get to that peacefully, because countries like India, even Taiwan, don't want to live under that hegemonic system. They don't want to have to look to Beijing. They want to have sovereign authority, or as much sovereign authority as they can get. I mean, it's different for a rising superpower like India than it is for a small country like Taiwan. But they want as much sovereignty as they can get. And the only way they're going to get that is balancing with countries like the United States, Japan, et cetera. If there's no war, I think what we will see is a continuation of the current dynamic, which is that countries, as China pushes harder, you see countries like South Korea shift more to balance. You'll see more diversification, de-risking, whatever you want to call it. So that doesn't end, but I mean, if I can see that, the Chinese can see that. That doesn't end well for China. China's kind of put in a box. The way it can break out of that is the use of force, because it can force countries like Taiwan, the Philippines, et cetera, and then break apart that anti-hegemonic coalition without fighting World War III, and achieve at a relatively low cost. That actually sounds pretty attractive for China when you think about it. And so that's why I worry a lot about a war over Taiwan. Yes, there's all the irredentist claims about the end of the Civil War, blah, blah, blah. But more worrisome is the fact that China has a rational incentive, both because, as I said, it needs to break out of that first island chain, because it's not going to go through the Himalayas realistically. It's not going to go through the jungles of Thailand and Myanmar or whatever. Its best option is to build a navy. Don't take it from me. They're doing it. And break out of that first island chain, then dominate, and then be in a stronger position to project power. And that's why I think, as I wrote in the Hindustan Times last year, it's so important for India, not because India cares about Taiwan per se, or should necessarily, but because if China wins a regional war against the United States in the Western Pacific, and the Americans are, as Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia under this administration, said the Chinese goal is to eject us from the Western Pacific, well, then the Chinese are going to be in a really strong position to agglomerate power, push into South Asia, and impose their will on you. And why wouldn't they? Right? I mean, appetite grows with the eating, as the old expression says. So again, I'm not sure we can defend Taiwan, but I mean, this is what worries me, is that they have a rational incentive. And then you look at all the evidence that's available, not all of it, but the big pieces of evidence: military buildup, nuclear buildup, sanction-proofing the economy, politically conditioning the population, providing a predicate for action. It looks like they're getting really ready for it.
That's a very doomsday scenario that you are painting out here for our viewers. But let me talk to you about the U.S.-India partnership and Prime Minister Modi. You met Prime Minister Narendra Modi recently. Right. India's role in this entire China dominance foray and this doomsday scenario that you're playing, it's not going to happen easily, because Mr. Modi is also a pretty strong leader, and who's sort of won successive elections because of his nationalistic credentials, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it was an extraordinary honor to be able to meet the Prime Minister earlier this year. So let me just say that I actually think, look, I think the Americans should be less intrusive into other countries' domestic affairs on a variety of points. But so it's not my place or intent to comment on the particular partisan issues within India. What I will say is, I think actually that nationalist sovereign, I think what from Mr. Jaishankar is called the Delhi way, is actually, the new Delhi way, is actually very compatible with what I'm talking about. Because my whole point is to say, look, let's not pretend that countries are all going to see things the same way or have a shared interest. That's obviously not. Instead, let's be more realistic. Let's recognize what countries' natural interests are, that countries want to have sovereign control. Nationalism is not a bad thing. I mean, in Western Europe, people think it's bad because they're now on the, so I mean, I'm an American nationalist. I want what's best for America. Obviously, I think enlightened and so forth, and shouldn't be cruel to others or that kind of thing. But I want what's best for my country. So let's work with other countries that have where our interests align, and more to the point, that are unabashed in the assertion of their interests. Because to get back to that point, what we want is more countries like India that have a very strong military, that have clear interests that they're unafraid to define, and will take the initiative to address them without holding Uncle Sam's hand. Like, we don't want more dependencies. We have, like, for instance, the Baltic states. I talk to them a lot. I'm very sympathetic, but they're essentially dependencies from a strategic point of view because they're too small to do anything. And some of them, like for instance, the Lithuanians, are very vocal, about a range of issues. And I'm thinking to myself, look, like, just focus on making sure that you can contribute on where you are most affected, and not like this kind of global crusade or what have you. I think that's what we need. So from my point of view, I think the future with India is very bright. And the key, and we should be willing to work with the Indians. And even more, look, obviously India is going to continue to see Pakistan as a threat. To me, India, China, that's the main kind of game. All right, well, let's work with the Indians on the Pakistan issue. I mean, we're not going to have perfect alignment of interests, but we should see it in that context.
In fact, many in the Indian establishment now consider Pakistan just an irritant. The main threat, the main threat is China. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, that's, for you to comment. Although I think this is actually an important point. I certainly agree, and I believe that it's proper. It's not proper for me to opine in this kind of public on the India's internal issues or in other countries as well.
Absolutely.
What is, I think, appropriate is for Americans or anybody, Indians, to look at our allies. One of the things that I think is so promising for the India relationship, and I'll contrast with the case of Taiwan, is India is saying, look, China's the big threat. We are looking at our own self-interest. We're going to tell the Americans where we agree, where we don't agree. We're going to look to collaborate, but we're not going to this global crusade they have on XYZ issues. We're not necessarily going to agree with you on Russia. We're not going to necessarily agree with you on Iran. But here's why, from our self-interested perspective, but it's rational. Okay, go back and forth. I don't expect a country like Taiwan, which is in real danger of being attacked and swallowed and subjected to large-scale re-education by the Chinese, is wrapping itself in the flag of Ukraine. And not even, I mean, their military is woefully inadequate to the situation and is not really moving. So it's almost like the opposite of in India. And to me, like, we want more partners like India. That's one of the reasons I'm very worried about Taiwan, is not only because of the Chinese intent, but because of the fundamental lack of seriousness on the part of Taiwan. And I think that's something that has to factor in to our analysis, because in the situation you mentioned, doomsday, I don't think war is inevitable, but I think it's a very real possibility to lose, and that would be a kind of doomsday scenario, not quite doomsday, but very, very, very bad. In that kind of world, I don't want people who are like spending their time. I mean, I spend a lot of time on Twitter because I think it's an effective vehicle for, to your point, but I mean, governments shouldn't be thinking that like Twitter is going to save them from the PLA. They should be like, no, we've got to, I mean, your military is up there in the Himalayas fighting the Chinese with sticks and axes. And the Taiwanese government is like, has Ukraine flag hashtags and is hoping that's going to save them the PLA. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Like, the PLA is not going to be stopped by hashtags on Twitter. It's going to be stopped by cold, hard steel or nothing at all.
And as you pointed out, it has to start with a possible rethinking, which you say has already begun in the Biden administration's rank and file, about not running with the hares and hunting with the hounds as far as Pakistan and India are concerned, or even as far as Israel and Qatar are concerned. The U.S. continues to consider Israel an ally, as well as Qatar, which hosts Hamas leaders. And that, again, is the same running with the hares and hunting with the hounds policy.
Yeah, and I think it's often a case of, sort of this we see farther kind of thing. And I mean, these issues are very complex. I mean, any of these issues is very complex, and I'm not trying to reduce them. But I mean, I think the basic attitude, both cases of India and Israel, is, we're on your side. And we might not agree on every particular, but we're gonna, like, we got your back, and we're gonna work this out together. But yeah, no, but I think it's that, but also that sort of confident. Basically, it's a coalition or alliance of sovereign nations that have their own interests and their own nationalist reasons, as opposed to this kind of rules-based international order soup that doesn't exist. I just put something on Twitter because Putin was criticizing the rules-based international order, and you don't have to like Putin to say that's a fair point. I was made the same point when I heard from the Chinese defense minister at Shangri-La. The rules-based international order, I think, in places like India, is considered selective and hypocritical, etc. And that's true. I mean, it is true. So, I mean, why are we focusing so much on something that's kind of doesn't really exist and is anyway not very effective as a propaganda point?
Got it. Thank you so much. I think we've stretched this conversation way longer than what we had planned for, but it was very fascinating talking to you. And these are, as you pointed out, these are complex issues. There's no right answer. There's just way options, because the outside alliances are actually testing the U.S.-India bilateral relationship, which needs to go up to a certain level now in a bid to counter
Well,
China.
I will say this. I mean, I think the relationship with India is, I mean, going forward is one that we need to really focus on. The relationship with Canada, for instance, and again, I'm against extraterritorial actions on our territory, very much against that. I think it's, but, India is up there banging with the PLA, and Canada is talking about the rules-based international order, but according to press reports, openly says it won't meet its 2% commitment. That we're going to have real reassessment across the board about our relationships.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives with us. Thank you, Elbridge Colby, for joining us. Thank you, viewers, for watching this podcast. We will come back to you with more. Stay tuned to Hindustan Times.